The adoption papers promised only one child, but that was a lie. In the winter of 1948, inside a small Vermont hospital, twin girls entered the world only to be torn apart within hours of birth. For 15 years, strangers would quietly enter their homes, measure their growth record, their play, and seal their childhoods away in hidden files. The parents never knew. The sisters never knew. Until one chance encounter unraveled the silence and forced the truth into daylight. This is Gothic Ledger. Before we open the sealed records of the Blackwood twins, pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time your clock reads right now. And if you haven't already subscribed, because the stories told here are the ones history tried to bury. The Burlington General Hospital of 1948 was not a place of comfort. Its walls, scrubbed endlessly with disinfectant, had faded to a dull, lifeless grey. Nurses moved like shadows between curtained bays, their shoes whispering across waxed linoleum floors. Their clipboards held more authority than the mothers whose trembling signatures were demanded at the bottom of each form. In one of those rooms, a woman recorded in surviving files only as struggling gave birth to 2 healthy daughters. The official log was exact, almost mechanical. Female infant A, 7 pounds even. Female infant B, 6 pounds 15 ounces. Both viable. No complications. Yet the details that mattered most were missing. No name for the mother, no occupation, no kinship noted, only a cold phrase circumstance alone, without sufficient means. In the post-war years, it was not unusual for impoverished women in Vermont to surrender children under quiet pressure. But this case bore the marks of design. Adoption agencies worked closely with hospitals, often stepping into decisions before a mother had regained her strength. Exhaustion blurred her will. Consent could be extracted in the space between delivery and discharge. Within hours, Louise Wise Services, a respected adoption agency with offices stretching from New York into northern states, had taken control. Their stamped files recorded placement initiated immediately. The phrasing was neutral, bureaucratic. Yet behind it lay the fracture the twins catalogued as separate cases. Their shared bloodline deliberately erased. On the ward, the rupture was disguised by routine. The 2 cribs, once side by side, were rolled into different alcoves. Paper tags replaced the bonds of blood. The mother, weak, pale, and surrounded by social workers with pre-written forms, signed where she was told. No scene, no protest, only the weariness of a woman cornered by scarcity. The final signature severed her forever from both daughters. She was never told that they would be raised apart. Archival notes record the moment with chilling simplicity. Adoption approved. Identical twin status, not disclosed to adoptive parties. It reads like procedure, not violation. Yet, in hindsight, the omission was deliberate and devastating. She left the hospital empty-armed. The case marked closed. The twins left, wrapped in separate blankets, anonymized their bond already buried beneath paperwork. No witness that day could have imagined that these sisters, born within minutes of each other, would not meet again for 15 long years. To the public, Louise Wise Services was a beacon of trust. It promised to place children into safe, stable homes and spoke in the language of charity and science. But inside its offices, decisions were calculated with a precision that left no room for sentiment. The files of infant A and infant B were separated into different folders, each stamped with distinct tracking numbers. no cross-reference, no hint of kinship. On paper, the twins no longer existed to each other. Placement moved quickly. Infant A, who would grow up under the name Margaret, was placed with an upwardly mobile family whose lifestyle matched the agency's image of respectability. Infant B, later named Eleanor, was marked as suitable for alternative placement and sent into the care of a modest working-class household. From that moment, their lives diverged parallel lines drawn by strangers destined to remain apart until chance and the unraveling of hidden records forced them together again. To an outsider, the division seemed like chance, a random sorting one infant to this family, the other to that. But inside the agency, nothing was random. It was a pattern, an orchestrated divergence crafted not for the children's welfare, but for observation. The secrecy was absolute. Adoptive parents were told only that their infant had no siblings. Paperwork made no mention of a twin. Contracts contained phrases like sole custody and without encumbrance of kin, shielding the agency from questions of blood ties. What seemed like a safeguard for privacy functioned instead as an eraser of identity. Behind these sterile words lay precedent. Psychological research of the late 1940s, still shadowed by eugenics and wartime experiments, had begun shaping adoption policy. Studies whispered that identical twins offered the perfect natural laboratory, same genetics, separate homes. By scattering them into contrasting households, agencies created living test subjects for the most ancient debate in psychology: nature versus nurture. No hesitation appears in the surviving files. Clerks typed placement letters, caseworkers filled out ledgers, supervisors signed approvals. Every step carried the weight of routine. None recorded doubt, none left testimony of objection. In the cribs, the two infants, indistinguishable, their eyes not yet open to the world, were already reduced to data points. Discharge day arrived without ceremony. 2 caseworkers collected the girls at staggered hours, ensuring no adoptive family would glimpse the other child. Margaret left, first swaddled in a crisp new blanket, handed into the arms of a couple waiting in a polished sedan. Hours later, Eleanor followed, wrapped in thinner cloth carried by her new parents to a bus stop. Both families believed they had been given a miracle. Neither realized half of it had been withheld. The agency's records close with clinical finality placement, completed files, sealed. What the ledgers do not admit is the consequence. 2 daughters of the same mother, born within minutes of each other, divided forever by a decision disguised as compassion. Not accident, not chance, design. By the early 1950s, Vermont itself embodied a quiet divide. On one side, factory towns worn thin by labor. On the other, polished avenues of post-war prosperity. Across this fracture, the twins were set, unknowingly cast as subjects in a living contrast. Margaret, placed in a house of means, grew among polished wood and deep carpets. Her adoptive father managed accounts for a regional bank. Her mother kept a home filled with lamps and shelves of books. Meals arrived at regular hours, roasts tall glasses of milk, desserts on porcelain plates. School was private uniforms, pressed teachers attentive. Her bedroom lace curtains drawn against the cold spoke of cultivated security. Eleanor's household was another world. Her adoptive father worked long shifts at a machine shop. Her mother stretched meals from ration books and jars. Their narrow clapboard house, paint flaking, furnace unreliable, carried cold through its walls. Nights were leaner dinners, plainer bread beans, little more. Her school was public, crowded, its books frayed by many hands. Leisure was scarce, chores constant. What Margaret learned from tutors and music lessons, Eleanor absorbed from watching her mother measure flour, sparingly from listening to her father's boots drag across the floor after double shifts. Agency notes would later describe this contrast as intentional rather than incidental. One child raised in affluence, the other in scarcity. Two tracks drawn away from a single origin. To researchers, it was data. To the girls, it was life. Yet, even beneath the divide, reflection persisted. Margaret, in her bright parlor, often withdrew into silence, watching from corners. Eleanor, in her dim kitchen, did the same. Both bit the insides of their cheeks when nervous. In classrooms divided by distance and class, their handwriting revealed the same slanting strokes. The circumstances diverged. The echoes remained. The census of 1950, when read, now reveals the outlines of their separation. Margaret's household recorded as owning property income steady, 3 members. Eleanor's entry marked as renter's income irregular 5 in the home with relatives taken in. To the archivist's eye, these paired columns stand as opposing entries in a single experiment. 2 children born minutes apart, their fates scattered for study. Families lived unaware. Margaret's parents praised her poise, calling it refinement. Eleanor's worried over her quietness, calling it shyness. Neither suspected that another girl carried the same traits elsewhere, that quirks they thought unique were threads of a shared inheritance. Threads deliberately severed yet stubbornly visible. This was the agency's ledger. 2 lives set as opposing entries. One shielded, one tested. One warmed, one chilled. Both observed in silence. By the early 1950s, the visits began. Social workers arrived at each home with the quiet authority of the state. Families welcomed them without suspicion, assuming they came to ensure the child's well-being. In truth, their notebooks did not serve the family. They harvested them. The researchers presented themselves as child service representatives, their appearances carefully ordinary. They arrived with soft voices offering reassurance, routine welfare inspections, a simple follow-up from the agency. Parents eager to be seen as responsible nodded with relief. They welcomed the strangers into kitchens and parlors, poured them tea, never suspecting that their children were being studied in silence. The intrusions began small. Height measured, weight recorded, the way a pencil was gripped, how a child answered questions about school or dreams. In Margaret's home, the visitor complimented her mother on the neat dining room, even as her daughter's posture was discreetly noted. In Eleanor's house, where wallpaper peeled and floorboards sighed, the visitor wrote of her reluctance to speak in full sentences. Both children were asked to draw to balance blocks to repeat words. What looked like harmless play was coded into research categories. The families were deceived. They believed these visits were ordinary follow-ups, proof the adoption had succeeded. But the notebooks told another story. Each page filled with coded assessments, side-by-side comparisons, later locked in filing cabinets. Neither Margaret's nor Eleanor's parents ever glimpsed what had been written. The rhythm of these visits settled in. Once or twice a year, always unannounced, always polite. Parents came to expect the knock, remarking privately on the persistence, but never suspecting they were part of a study. In that era, institutions were rarely questioned. The authority of a clipboard was enough to mask intent. Sometimes equipment appeared. A camera said to help with developmental assessment captured a child's face as she read aloud. A tape recorder clicked quietly from inside a bag. Parents were told the recordings were for educational purposes. In truth, they were artifacts for comparison fragments filed away to swell the ledgers of an unseen design. The tone remained courteous, never overtly intrusive. Yet beneath it lingered a quiet menace. Margaret and Eleanor were being reduced, visit by visit, into variables. Their laughter, their hesitation, the way their hands fidgeted in laps, all converted into data points. Each session harvested lives beneath the illusion of care. Behind the polished doors of adoption agencies, another office dictated the course of their childhood. At its center stood Dr. Peter Neubauer, a psychiatrist whose influence stretched across child development institutions. To his colleagues, he was a visionary probing the oldest question in psychology, inheritance, or environment. To the families supplying him subjects, he was invisible, a name absent from records yet present in every decision. Neubauer's study was never advertised. It lived in locked filing cabinets in ledgers marked only by initials in reels of tape and folders of transcripts. The language stripped children into measurements. Subject A, female adoptive household urban professional class. Subject B, female adoptive household rural working class. No mention of their connection. Their kinship erased to allow the experiment to unfold as if they had never shared a womb. The design was methodical. Identical twins placed apart across the Northeast. Families told nothing. Researchers disguised as welfare workers arrived on rotations gathering data with quiet precision. The protocols included block building memory, recall Rorschach ink blots. Some children played with dolls as observers recorded their gestures of care. Others were asked to draw families they did not know existed their sketches later, compared to those of their hidden siblings. Margaret and Eleanor were but two entries in a larger experiment spanning decades. Each visit produced pages of notes, later transcribed into formal reports. Each photograph carefully labeled and stored in drawers, opened only by select researchers. Neubauer believed these materials would form his legacy proof of how environment molds the self. Ethics went unmentioned. The atmosphere of the study was one of secrecy, disguised as rigor. Reports written in detached prose spoke of outcomes, never of children divided. Neubauer's name appeared on memoranda, on correspondence with fellow psychologists, but never on adoption contracts. Families never met him, yet their daughters' lives were charted by his hand. The laboratory was not one room, but a network. Kitchens and parlors turned into test sites, schools funneling exam results. Agency files transformed into conduits of data. The study borrowed the language of welfare but practiced the mechanics of control. Over time, the files swelled to thousands of pages. Locked drawers told parallel stories of children, raised apart similarities and differences catalogued with forensic precision. Neubauer envisioned the collection as his final triumph in the nature-nurture debate. Yet behind every charted trait lay children treated as specimens, their lives shaped by a secret experiment cloaked as science. From the earliest years, the files began recording patterns that unsettled even the experiment's logic. Margaret and Eleanor raised in homes separated by miles, and class displayed the same inexplicable traits. The records describe these details in flat language, but together they form a mirrored portrait. Handwriting samples collected during routine assessments reveal it most clearly. Both girls bent their letters at the same angle, their strokes collapsing with the same hesitation. The handwriting of the two girls carried such uncanny similarity that when papers were later archived without names, clerks routinely mistook one for the other. It could not be explained by shared instruction, for Margaret received careful drills from private tutors while Elena copied words in a crowded classroom with worn, uneven books. Yet the lines they traced appeared identical, as though their hands obeyed the same hidden rhythm. Other details surfaced in the records, small, intimate habits that pointed to the same invisible tether. Both girls, when seated, tucked the left leg beneath themselves even during formal interviews. A researcher observing Margaret in her family's parlor noted the nervous chewing of her inner cheek. Weeks later, in another town, another observer wrote the very same note into Elena's file. Both developed a fear of thunderstorms, retreating under beds with their hands pressed to their ears, though neither family could name an event that might have planted the fear. Dreams, too, echoed between them. Margaret woke her mother one night, insisting that a shadow stood at her door. Months later, Elena startled her adoptive father with the same words, "a shadow at the door." To the families, such moments were dismissed as childish imagination. To the researchers, the parallels defied explanation. Their project, designed to prove that children could be shaped entirely by environment, instead revealed how biology reasserted itself in defiance of circumstance. Rather than abandon the study, the observers leaned in. The files grew denser, the descriptions sharper. Still, the tone remained clinical, suppressing wonder with the language of science. Subject demonstrates repetitive behavior, possible genetic predisposition. And yet, read together the entries betray astonishment. The twins, divided by design, resisted division. Each household saw only fragments. Margaret's habit of chewing her cheek was taken as delicate refinement. Elena's as stubborn shyness. One family called the girl sensitive, the other private. Only within the sealed cabinets of Neubauer's archives did the patterns converge. There, in mirrored handwriting, posture, fears, and dreams, the experiment yielded its unintended result, proof that kinship survives even deliberate severance. By the mid-1950s, the rhythm of observation had become a fixture in both households. At first, the visits seemed ordinary, a welfare agency ensuring the adoptions had succeeded. But as the years passed, the questions grew sharper, the tests less disguised as play. What had once felt like support took on the shape of surveillance. Margaret's parents, disciplined and discreet, seldom voiced their unease. Yet even they admitted privately to wondering why the inspections never ceased. The pattern repeated like ritual: a knock at the door, polite greetings, notebooks opened, and quiet requests for cooperation. Margaret was asked to stack blocks, memorize patterns, recount her dreams. Once her mother was given a questionnaire about solitude, nervousness, and temperament. She filled it out dutifully, though later confessed she never knew where the answers went or why they were wanted. For Elena's family, the scrutiny was harder to ignore. Their small home could not hide the presence of outsiders. Clipboards scraped across worn kitchen tables as questions pressed into her parents' evenings. Does she fear noises? Does she mix with other children? The wording seemed rehearsed, designed to reveal flaws. Elelanena was instructed to draw a house balance. A coin repeat a sequence of words, each task carefully recorded. Her father, exhausted from long shifts, once asked why the agency still required such reports years after the adoption. The visitor smiled, but offered no answer. Suspicion grew quietly. Neighbors who had adopted never saw such constant inspections. Relatives elsewhere were spared this level of attention. Why then were their daughters examined as though under a magnifying glass? Both families felt the weight of unspoken doubt, yet dared not voice it too loudly. To question the institution risked appearing ungrateful, or worse, unfit. The children themselves soon felt the weight of these visits. Margaret grew cautious. Her replies clipped her hands folded tightly in her lap. Elelanena developed the habit of averting her gaze, fixing on windows or doors, rather than the faces of those who questioned her. In private, both confided their unease, wondering why they were measured and tested without reason. Still, they complied, for resistance only brought firmer insistence from the adults with notebooks. What their families did not see was the structure behind the visits. Observations taken from kitchens and parlors traveled to locked offices where the data was catalogued, cross-referenced, and compared against parallel files. The repetition that exhausted the parents was no accident, but design. Longitudinal study, year after year across all of childhood. Each doubt recorded in the home became evidence of method in the study's ledger. By the end of the 1950s, suspicion had hardened into quiet resignation. The families endured the cycle as one endures an unwelcome season, unavoidable, inevitable. Doors kept opening, papers kept arriving, questions kept repeating. In both households, an unspoken shadow grew heavier. Their children were being watched for reasons no one explained. The summer of 1963 broke that silence. The Vermont State Fair spread noise and color across the fields, Ferris wheels spinning, vendors calling out prices. The smell of fried dough drifting through dusty lanes. Among the crowds, two families moved separately, unaware that chance was about to unravel years of secrecy. Margaret, 15, walked with her parents in pressed clothing. Her hair tied neat, the image of her household's order. Elsewhere, Elelanena, the same age, stepped through the fairgrounds in a plainer dress, her shoes scuffed from hand-me-downs. Both carried themselves with the same wary restraint that observers had noted since childhood: shoulders, slightly drawn eyes, alert, but guarded. The collision came by chance near the livestock pens. Margaret stopped short. Across the path, Elelanena froze. For a heartbeat, the fair dissolved the crowd. The vendors, the rumble of rides, all fell silent. Two girls stood facing each other, mirrors raised in open air. Witnesses later spoke of the stillness, the same slope of the jaw, the same arch of the brow, the same nervous tightening of hands. Strangers whispered, "Are they sisters?" Neither family had been told another child existed. For Margaret's parents, the sight was shattering. Their singular daughter doubled. For Elelanena's parents, the shock burned with betrayal. Why had no one spoken of this? The girls themselves stepped hesitantly toward one another, recognition flickering across their faces. It was not the meeting of strangers, but of echoes made flesh. In that instant, the agency's secrecy collapsed. No paperwork could conceal what the fairground dust had revealed. Questions rushed forth, Who are you? Where are you from? What is your name? Yet, the answers were already visible. The resemblance was its own proof. Families left the fair early, shaken into silence. The girls said little, but their shared presence carried the weight of revelation. In the files later written by researchers, the event was acknowledged only in code. Subjects became aware of one another. But for those who stood there, it was a rupture, an accident that destroyed the architecture of concealment. In the weeks that followed, neither household could ignore what they had seen. Photographs were compared, dates aligned, documents spread across tables. Each detail confirmed what had been silently visible. That summer afternoon, Margaret and Elena were not curiosities or cousins, but identical twins separated from birth. The revelation forced uneasy alliance. Margaret's parents, deferential to institutions, now sat across from Elena's, who had lived with far less assurance. Contracts, placement letters, official correspondence. Each document carried the same phrase, an only infant without encumbrance of kin. The identical wording, once routine legal formality, was now evidence of deception. Margaret's mother called it betrayal. We were told she had no family. Elena's father was harsh a fraud in the name of science. Yet, in that era, institutions still carried unquestioned authority. The families had signed the papers, trusted the assurances, built their lives on what they were told. The depth of betrayal only grew as they compared their daughters' mirrored mannerisms, nervous tics, even the same faint scar from childhood accident. The question shifted from if deception had occurred to why. Why had the truth of kinship been hidden? What purpose was served by division? Letters were written. Replies, when they came, were evasive. Officials spoke of policy of confidentiality, of sealed records. Requests for disclosure were denied. Behind closed doors, parents traded rumors, other adoptions, other unusual visits, other children shadowed by the same scrutiny. Slowly, a large pattern began to take shape, whispered rather than spoken aloud. Anger hardened. The parents had been deceived twice, first in adoption, then in years of false reassurance. They had raised their daughters in good faith, unaware that each milestone was echoed in another household. The files, when read, now preserved their betrayal with chilling calm placement. Completed records sealed. Confrontation came not in courts, but in the plain corridors of the agency. Families entered with photographs and contracts in hand, demanding answers. Louise Vice Services, once cloaked in authority, now stood accused of concealment. Their case was simple. Two daughters, identical, adopted apart, under files declaring each to be an only child. They asked only, why were we not told? Why were they divided? The replies were evasive. Staff repeated that policy demanded confidentiality, that all placements were proper. But when pressed, fragments surfaced. One administrator admitted siblings were sometimes separated, citing only suitability of homes. Another, faced with evidence, conceded that identical twins had indeed been placed apart in multiple cases, while denying any knowledge of a larger plan. Each admission came wrapped in denial. Partial truths meant to diffuse, never to clarify. The families, left unsatisfied, began their own search. Quiet conversations with other adoptive parents revealed unsettling echoes of their own story. Children whose files carried the same erasures, households that remembered repeated visits from officials who measured and questioned without reason. What had seemed like an anomaly now revealed itself as a pattern. The Blackwood twins were not an exception but a single fragment of something wider, an experiment dressed in the costume of welfare. The parents' anger cooled into a grim clarity. Their daughters had not been placed as children to be raised, but deployed as subjects to be measured. Every milestone, first words, first steps. School reports had been observed not for family joy, but for institutional data. The agency's secrecy, its refusal to unseal files, showed the depth of its complicity. And yet, the confrontation never became public scandal. Mid-century culture still bowed to authority. Families were warned that pressing too far might harm the children's adjustment. Threats of lawsuits were met with quiet assurances of private settlements provided confidentiality was observed. Behind closed doors, files were shifted deeper into archives and reports were locked away. The truth was not denied. It was buried. To read those records now is to sense the machinery of institutional defense at work. Letters of complaint were acknowledged with courteous phrases. Your concerns have been noted. Your cooperation is appreciated. Requests for disclosure were refused under headings of policy and privacy law. Every line crafted not to clarify, but to delay to contain. Still, the confrontation left its mark. The families understood with certainty that their daughters were not alone, that somewhere across New England, other twins lived in parallel ignorance, studied under the same invisible gaze. They had touched the edges of a design, larger than themselves, though its full shape remained hidden. The agency survived intact, its denials polished. But in its files, the confrontation lingered as a reminder that silence is not innocence, and that once seen, some truths cannot be unseen. What might have erupted into scandal instead dissolved into quiet settlements. After the confrontation, the families sought counsel, drafting letters that spoke of fraud, concealment, emotional harm. They threatened suits. Each threat met the same immovable wall: institutions, fluent in silence. Louise Wise Services answered not with confession but with offers. Settlements were prepared behind closed doors, conditioned on secrecy. Families who pressed too firmly were reminded that publicity might expose their daughters to harm. The instinct to shield rather than fight became the lever by which resistance was subdued. Checks were issued, signatures obtained, outrage transformed into legal clauses of silence. No hearings were held. No stories appeared in the press. The state, when presented with complaints, deferred to the agency's reputation and the legality of contracts already signed. Officials declared that no laws had been broken, that the matter was best managed privately. Accountability dissolved into procedure. The settlements followed a script. Each began with polite acknowledgement of misunderstandings, never admissions of deception. Each bound the families to silence forbidding claims or contact with journalists. Parents were tied not only by signatures but by fear. Fear that public exposure might wound their daughters more than the secret already had. Mid-century precedent favored such containment. Adoption agencies and psychiatric institutions operated beneath a veil of deference. Their practices, even when contested, were shielded by claims of expertise and public service. To question too loudly risked being branded ungrateful, disruptive, unstable. Those who accepted settlement lived thereafter in quiet compromise. They carried knowledge of what had been done, but could not voice it. Their daughters, now aware of one another, grew side by side under the shadow of separation, and under the heavier knowledge that no institution would be made to answer. In archives, the traces remain: legal papers, stamped, sealed agreements, signed without fanfare correspondence that ends abruptly with the words, "matter resolved." These fragments testify not to resolution but to repression. The public never heard the full story. The experiment endured in shadow, its scope unchallenged by law, its victims bound by contracts that erased their voices. Silence replaced truth. And in that silence, institutions survived unbroken. The files reveal a symmetry as chilling as the twins themselves. Just as Margaret and Elena were hidden from one another, so too was the story of their exploitation hidden from the world. The families bound by clauses of confidentiality became unwilling participants in their own silencing. The agency cloaked in secrecy ensured that what should have erupted as scandal survived only as a whisper. One more file sealed in a vault, one more set of questions without reply. For Margaret and Elena, discovery of one another was not an ending, but a beginning, the spark of a deeper fracture. This rupture was not of blood, but of selfhood. To realize that their lives had been engineered, their separation not necessity, but design, was to feel the ground of identity collapse beneath them. Accounts from later years describe a churred sense of displacement that lingered like a shadow. Margaret, raised in comfort, confessed that her childhood now felt staged, her triumphs less like victories than entries in a ledger kept by unseen hands. Elena, shaped by scarcity, spoke of betrayal, the suspicion that her hardships had been chosen for her, assigned like roles in an experiment she had never agreed to join. The scars were invisible, but enduring. Both carried an ache of incompleteness, as though each choice made in youth had been observed, weighed, and written down by strangers. To discover quirks mirrored in another person was destabilizing. To realize those quirks had been measured, catalogued, and filed away was haunting. Their story echoed that of other separated siblings: abandonment, mistrust of authority, difficulty forming lasting bonds. Later psychologists would admit the forced severing of twins produced a trauma unique in kind, invisible yet persistent, shaping attachment and identity for decades. For Margaret and Elena, this wound carried a special cruelty: the knowledge that it had been inflicted not by accident, but under the deliberate guise of science. After their fairground reunion, both families recorded changes. Margaret grew quieter, her silence misread by parents as refinement. Elena grew volatile, her anger breaking through in school and home disputes. Both began to question the narratives that had once seemed unquestionable. Adoption no longer looked like salvation, it looked like theft. Home was no longer refuge, but reminder. Sparse medical notes suggest Elena sought counseling in her teens. Margaret carried her unrest silently into adulthood. The bond of blood endured, but years apart had carved scars recognition could not erase. The experiment meant to illuminate the boundary between nature and nurture, instead created an identity caught between them. Margaret and Elena were neither fully shaped by their homes nor fully preserved by their shared inheritance. They lived suspended in the knowledge of interference, haunted by who they were, who they might have been, and who they had been turned into for research. The files are silent on these consequences. They record only behaviors, not meanings, measurements, not wounds. Yet in those coded entries lies an unmeasured truth. The greatest damage was not what the twins displayed for researchers, but what they carried unseen, the enduring knowledge that their childhoods had been orchestrated as a test. The Blackwood twins were not anomaly, but precedent. In the wake of their reunion, whispers surfaced fragments of testimony, stray records, rumors pointing to a larger design. The same agency, the same evasive paperwork, the same pattern of polite welfare workers entering homes with clipboards and questions offering no explanation. Archival fragments confirm what families had only suspected. Neubauer's study, never formally acknowledged, drew its strength from numbers. Twins, even triplets, divided deliberately across households. Each child raised in ignorance of their kin. Files written in the same veiled phrases, no encumbrance of siblings, single infant placement. Children reduced to living datasets, scattered across New England, like seeds planted for later observation. Decades later, some victims stumbled upon their mirrors. A stranger on the street bearing their exact face, a photograph clipped from an obituary, a neighbor's careless remark. Most, however, never met. For every reunion, countless separations remained permanent, their symmetry broken, their parallels unacknowledged. Testimonies that survive echo the same refrain. Families recalling endless surveys, children coaxed into unexplained tests, parents wondering why their household attracted so much official attention. And always, when pressed, the same reply: "We cannot disclose details." A phrase that functioned as both shield and silence. Scattered confirmations emerge. In archives, a 1960s memorandum on twin placements under divergent conditions. An unpublished graduate thesis describing families haunted by secrecy. Private letters in which Neubauer himself referred to his remarkable laboratory of human development language that betrayed both the scope and the detachment of his work. The horror lies not in one case, but in its repetition. The lives of Margaret and Elena reflected in dozens of others, each separation serving the same cold question: nature or nurture. The children never consented. Their parents never knew. What might have been stories of kinship became instead lines of data filed, sealed, forgotten. The wider picture is one of quiet devastation. For every Margaret and Elena, there were others whose names remained buried, their files locked or destroyed, their siblings never found. Some grew to adulthood without ever learning the truth. Others carried suspicion, like a lifelong shadow, but never found proof. What endures are fragments, settlements, signed archives sealed the soft machinery of silence. And in that silence, the experiment continued. The reach of the experiment stretched far beyond anything the public ever learned, its scale concealed beneath deliberate secrecy. What began as the discovery of a single family unfolded into a pattern, a network of hidden separations, a silent system that treated children not as sons or daughters, but as instruments of study. The Blackwoods were not alone. They were simply among the rare few whose paths intersected by chance, exposing what the archives had labored so carefully to keep unseen. The trail of the Blackwood experiment did not end with confrontation. It ended in storage. By the 1980s, decades of notes, films, and transcripts were transferred from agency offices to an academic institution that promised preservation while guaranteeing silence. Yale University accepted Dr. Peter Neubauer's records, locking them in its archives under conditions of near-total restriction. The materials arrived not in fragments, but in bulk boxes of folders reels of magnetic tape, envelopes of photographs. Case numbers replaced names' initials stood in for families. Together, they represented not only the Blackwood twins, but dozens of other children divided in the name of science. What had once been dispersed across households, disguised as routine welfare visits, was now condensed into a single vault, a ledger of human lives stripped to data. The access policy was blunt. The papers would remain sealed until 2066, not withheld for a few cautious years, but embargoed for more than a century. By then the children would be elderly or gone, the descendants left with memories too faint to form testimony. The length of the seal guaranteed that those most harmed would never read the words written about them. Defenders cloaked the decision in the language of privacy protection, of participants' safeguarding, of sensitive material prevention of misinterpretation. But the effect was a razzia. Families seeking answers were told the archive was inaccessible. Their requests refused. They knew the evidence existed, stacked in boxes preserved in climate control, but it remained forbidden. The collection's skeletal finding aids confirmed its immensity. Thousands of pages of notes, hours of film meticulous assessments. Yet, the content itself lay locked. The symbolism was undeniable. The very experiment that had separated siblings and concealed their identities now imposed the same fate upon its own history. Sealed, withheld, rendered inaccessible. Margaret and Elena had been kept apart, and so too were the truths of their childhoods kept apart from the record. Concealment presented as protection, secrecy defended as necessity. For archivists, this read as policy. For families, it was betrayal extended across generations. What had been taken from them in childhood was withheld again in adulthood. The chance to know, to understand, to reckon. The archive sat in New Haven, waiting for a year its subjects would likely never see. Until then, the truth of the Blackwood twins and all the others remained suspended, locked away a hidden ledger of lives divided by design and silenced by decree. By 1995, the study that had begun in secrecy entered its final act. Entire sections of the archive were marked for destruction. Boxes of files, reels of tape, and stacks of handwritten notes, materials that had followed children from crib to classroom, were reduced to ash and pulp. The official explanations cited redundancy, confidentiality, and the impracticality of indefinite storage. Yet to those who sought answers, the act was unmistakable evidence erased. Staff accounts confirmed the scale. Magnetic tape reels brittle with age were incinerated. Paper files containing decades of longitudinal observations were shredded beyond recognition. Photographs once sealed in envelopes labeled with initials and case numbers vanished into bins. What had been preserved under lock and embargo was now simply gone. The destruction was not incidental. It was deliberate, carried out with institutional authority, broad enough to ensure that much of the study's most direct evidence would never be read. Fragments survived by accident. A stray memorandum left in a university office. A duplicate chart misfiled in a government bureau. A researcher's personal notes kept long after their official use. These remnants offered glimpses, case numbers hinting at unnamed siblings, references to triplets, divided mentions of follow-up visits that extended into adulthood. But without the central files, the pattern fractured. Its full scope dissolved into speculation for Margaret and Elena. By then, grown women, the loss was personal. They knew their lives had been documented in exhaustive detail. They understood that notebooks once described their habits, fears, and mirrored traits in cold handwriting. Yet when they sought answers, they met only absence. What remained of their childhoods existed in memory, alone unconfirmed by the records that might have explained the design. Silence deepened, not because the evidence was sealed, but because it was destroyed. Speculation filled the void. How many children had been treated as experiments in America's pursuit of psychological control? How many siblings divided, tested, and discarded? Some estimates spoke of dozens, others of more. Their lives scattered across states, their bonds erased by decree. Without the files, numbers blurred into rumor tragedies, into nameless shadows. The destruction mirrored the study itself, concealment, masked as procedure silence, justified as necessity. What was once hidden in locked cabinets was now hidden in absence. In both cases, the result was the same. Truth deferred accountability, avoided voices stilled. Today, the Yale archive still holds what fragments remain, sealed until 2066. Yet, even when that date arrives, much will already be lost. The records destroyed in 1995 will not reappear. Their contents exist only as shadows. For the families, the question remains unanswered. In the end, the Blackwood files offer not revelation but erasure. Where records should exist, there is absence. Where truth should endure, there is silence. And where closure should come, only a question remains. How many children lived their lives as unwitting specimens? Their histories reduced to ash in the vaults of American science. The story of the Blackwood twins does not end with reunion. It ends as it began, in silence. The experiment never faced the light of a courtroom. It was buried instead, quietly, efficiently, within archives and bureaucratic policies. Its harm did not vanish, but slipped silently from one generation into the next. For Margaret and Elena, the burden lay not only in what they endured, but in what they were forbidden to know. Knowledge withheld became its own form of injury. And for us, decades later, a question hangs in the air, unanswered and unnerving. How many others? How many twins were separated? How many families divided under the same invisible hand? Perhaps one day the vaults will open. Perhaps in 2066, when the sealed files expire and the fragments surface, the scale of deception will at last be given its true name. Until then, we are left with speculation, with absence, and with the cold certainty that the truth was not lost by accident, but erased with intent. As we close this account, I turn gently to you. Where are you listening from tonight? And as these words reach you, what time does your clock strike? Write it below. I read every entry. If this story has unsettled you, if the silence of the Blackwood files lingers in your thoughts as it does in mine, press like and subscribe to Gothic Ledger. Here we bring to light the shadows history tried to bury and speak, the stories institutions prayed would remain unsaid. For in these sealed archives, in the ash of vanished pages, something still endures. And sometimes, silence speaks louder than truth. The experiment never faced the light of a courtroom. It was buried instead, quietly, efficiently, within archives and bureaucratic policies. Its harm did not vanish, but slipped silently from one generation into the next. For Margaret and Elelanena, the burden lay not only in what they endured, but in what they were forbidden to know. Knowledge withheld became its own form of injury. And for us, decades later, a question hangs in the air unanswered and unnerving: how many others, how many twins were separated, how many families divided under the same invisible hand. Perhaps one day the vaults will open. Perhaps in 2066, when the sealed files expire and the fragments surface, the scale of deception will at last be given its true name. Until then, we live with speculation, with absence, and with the cold certainty that the truth was not lost by accident, but erased with intent. And here is where the story lingers on the edges of history, where silence does not erase, but distorts. Somewhere in the sealed archives lies a paper trail, faded signatures, numbers, reports typed by hands that never imagined their secrecy would one day fray. Somewhere in a filing cabinet locked away beneath dust and iron are the missing names, siblings who never met voices, who never knew to call out for one another. What would it mean if all of those names surfaced at once? If the threads were pulled together and those who were divided suddenly recognized the shape of their own story? Would it be healing, or would it wound again, reopening grief that families had been forced to bury? That is the paradox of silence. It can shield, but it also corrodes. It can protect children from scandal in one era, while leaving them with unanswered questions in the next. And once the silence breaks, there is no returning to ignorance. As we close this account, I turn gently to you. Where are you listening from tonight? And as these words reach you, what time does your clock strike? Write it below. I read every entry. If this story unsettled you, if the silence of the Blackwood files lingers in your thoughts as it does in mine, press like and subscribe to Gothic Ledger. Here we bring to light the shadows history tried to bury and speak, the stories institutions prayed would remain unsaid. For in these sealed archives, in the ash of vanished pages, something still endures. And sometimes, silence speaks louder than truth. And perhaps, one day when the doors of those archives are finally opened, when the ink of forgotten names meets the light again, it will not be historians or lawyers who give voice to the story, but the very children who were once reduced to files. Until then, we wait, we wonder, and we listen for echoes in the silence.